Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Gaudette, and welcome back to another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I walk you through my 5 favorite albums from every year. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the year 1977, and now as we get closer and closer to the new decade of the 80s, we're starting to hear more and more shifts in the new types of styles that are being implemented, with some of the early developments of genres like new wave, disco, punk rock, and electronic. And I gotta say, I was completely blown away at how many great albums came out of this year. Of all of the years that I've covered for the decade of the 70s up to this point, I think that 77 very well might be one of the strongest years for 70s music. There were just so many gems that came out of this year, and it made it pretty hard to narrow it down to a top 5. But after a lot of thought and a lot of re-listens to a bunch of different records, I think I came up with my definitive top 5 favorite albums of 1977. So without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite albums, starting with number 5. Coming in at number 5 is Trans-Europe Express by Kraftwerk, an amazing record that contains a little bit of everything that I love about Kraftwerk's sound. The theme of this album is centered around Europe and the European railway service, and one of the things that I love so much about this record is the contrasting moods between the beginning and ending of the record, and then the entire middle point. The opening and closing track are more upbeat and feel good, but then the entire middle point of this record goes into some really dark and ominous territories with tracks like Showroom Dummies and the title track Trans-Europe Express, which is, in my opinion, one of the coolest and most unique sounding Kraftwerk songs ever written. The vocoder creates these otherworldly-like sounds, and the wide use of different synthesizers, electronics, and sequencers combined with that vocoder creates these sounds that were just so ahead of their time for 1977. And Trans-Europe Express and Showroom Dummies are two tracks that would easily make my favorite Kraftwerk song list. It's one of those records that can really take you through this magical journey that has all sorts of disorienting qualities to it. And like I said, not only does it show you the more upbeat and feel-good side of Kraftwerk's writing, but it also goes deep into the trenches and shows you the really dark and eerie textures that they are capable of creating, with all of the different technological advancements of the time on full display all throughout this track listing. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on Kraftwerk's entire discography, I did do a video where I ranked all of their studio albums, so if you're interested in checking that out, it will be in the tier list playlist, which will be linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 5 favorite album of 1977. Now on to number 4. Alright, coming in at number 4 is Talking Heads 77, which is the debut record from the legendary English band The Talking Heads. I absolutely love this record. Stylistically, this album is a lot different from everything else in their discography, and it contains certain elements of their writing style that I personally think is some of the most interesting stuff that they've ever written. Stylistically, it contains this great blend of art rock, new wave, dance, and punk, which makes for some great variety and surprise from one track to the next. I love every single song on here from beginning to end, with a lot of standout and exceptional tracks and musical moments. And as a guitar player, this album definitely contains my favorite guitar work of any Talking Heads record, and that's one of the elements that I actually do miss in a lot of their future albums, and I wish they did it a little bit more, because this record has some truly unique guitar writing that I think is much different from everything else in their discography. And you can hear it on tracks like Happy Day, No Compassion, The Book I Read, and Don't Worry About the Government. We also have some groovy, feel-good dance flavors on tracks like New Feeling, Who Is It?, and Pulled Up. And of course, this album contains the track that the Talking Heads are probably most well known for, Psycho Killer, which obviously is an incredible track that goes without saying. And one critique that I do hear some people give to this record is that the production is not as strong as it would be on future releases. And I do agree that the production is a little bit more raw, but at the same time, I think that it works really well with the stylistic territories that they were exploring on this record, because like I said, it is very different from their other albums. So I think the difference in the production style actually works pretty well with what they're doing on this. But of course, when Brian Eno comes into the picture, the production style reaches new levels, but also the songwriting goes into different territories as well. But for a debut album, I do not think they could have done a better job, and I think this is a very unique album to come out of 1977 that sounds unlike anything else that was released from that year. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on the Talking Heads' entire discography, I also have a video where I rank all of their studio albums, so be sure to check that out in the tier list playlist linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 4 album of 1977. Now on to number 3. All right, coming in at number 3 is Asia by Steely Dan. In my previous episode of 1976, their previous record, The Royal Scam, had actually come in as my number 1 favorite album of that year, and I had said that that's my number 1 favorite Steely Dan record, and Asia would be a very close second. So 76 and 77 were an incredible period in the Steely Dan discography. And this record is incredible on so many different fronts. Top-notch songwriting, incredible production from Gary Katz, amazing personnel with all sorts of great guest features like Larry Carlton, Bernard Purdie, Wayne Shorter, Steve Gadd, and Michael McDonald, among many others. It's 7 tracks long, and from beginning to end, I think it's incredible. Lots of colorful and unorthodox jazz harmonies, great grooves, interesting feel changes from section to section, and really lush instrumentations that bring out all of the magic in these incredible songs. If I had to pick a couple of favorite tracks on here, I would go with Deacon Blues, Peg, and Josie. I don't think they could have concluded the album with a better track than Josie, and Deacon Blues very well might be my number 1 favorite Steely Dan track. I kind of bounce between a couple of different favorites depending on what mood I'm in, but a lot of times Deacon Blues does come in as my number 1 favorite Steely Dan track. I think that song is absolutely amazing, and it just contains every element that I love about Steely Dan. And I really enjoy the fact that they stretch out some of these songs a bit more and allow for some guest soloists, which is really nice to hear and just adds another additional layer to this already incredible album. And again, if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on Steely Dan's entire discography, I did do a video ranking all of their studio albums, so be sure to check that out in the tier list playlist in the comments and the description if you are interested. And that is my number 3 favorite album of 1977. Now on to number 2. Okay, coming in at number 2 is Low by David Bowie, an absolutely incredible record that was a significant turning point in David Bowie's writing style, and in my opinion, this is the best record of his entire very large discography. This would be the first of 3 albums that would be known as the Berlin Trilogy, where he collaborated with Brian Eno and producer Tony Visconti, and because of the collaboration of Brian Eno, a chunk of this album did go into more of the electronic and ambient sort of territory. And I think the pairing of David Bowie and Brian Eno created some really incredible and magical sounding music. The album is 11 tracks long, and side 1 consists of 7 songs that are more in that art rock and art pop sort of territory, with so many unique synth sounds, tape loops, and just very colorful layering that shows you all of the technological capabilities that were available in 1977. Side 1 opens and closes with 2 very tasteful instrumental tracks, and then in between that we have 5 vocal tracks. My personal favorites from side 1 would be Sound and Vision and the opening track, Speed of Life. And then side 2 gives us 4 more tracks, and in my opinion, this is really where the magic starts to happen. We veer off into that more ambient electronic territory, and this side has Brian Eno flavors all over it. And this side takes us through so many different emotions, with moments that are very dark and intense, moments that have a sense of urgency to them, but also moments that feel very peaceful and serene. And anytime I listen to the second side of this record, it just puts me in a whole nother world. It's really a trip to listen to these 4 tracks back to back. My personal favorites from side 2 are the opening track, Varsava, which has some really beautiful and mysterious melodies. And I also really love the closing track, Subterraneans. Between the spacey synth sounds, the vocal melodies, and the saxophone, it creates such a beautiful atmosphere that concludes this album in the best way possible. So I cannot say enough good things about this record. I think the pairing of David Bowie, Brian Eno, and Tony Visconti produced some really exceptional music, and like I said, I would consider this the best album of David Bowie's entire discography. So that is my number 2 album, and now for the grand reveal, here is my number 1 favorite album of 1977. Alright, coming in as my number 1 favorite album of 1977 is Animals by Pink Floyd. This is actually my favorite Pink Floyd album, and oftentimes I think it gets overshadowed by Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall, but I really think this is the strongest album of their discography. Similar to their previous album, Wish You Were Here, this record contains fewer tracks, but the songs are much longer and more stretched out. This one is 5 tracks long, and the opening and closing tracks are these shorter, more upbeat acoustic tracks titled Pigs on the Wing Part 1 and 2. And then the middle 3 tracks are much longer and take on some much more dark characteristics, which is not surprising given the fact that Roger Waters wrote almost the entirety of this album, with the exception of one track that him and David Gilmour co-wrote together. And I've always thought that Roger Waters has this amazing ability to write these really dark and eerie songs, and that's a side of the Pink Floyd sound that I personally have always resonated with, and that is on full display all throughout these 3 tracks. And this is a concept album focusing on the political conditions in Britain at that time, focusing on issues like inequality, the power dynamic between the upper and lower class, which fuels this inequality, and traits that can be found in ruthless upper-class businessmen. And the different animals that are used in each track serve as a metaphor for these different traits of these upper-class businessmen. Compositionally and lyrically, I think Roger Waters is on top of his game on this record, and I think the political climate of that time fueled some of the best songs that Roger Waters has ever written for Pink Floyd. And this record contains my number 1 favorite Pink Floyd song, which is Dogs. That is a track that I can listen to over and over and over again and never get tired of it. And for a song that is 17 minutes in length, there is not one wasted moment. Every section change keeps you engaged. The lyrics are amazing. The chord changes are very unique. And it's got some seriously awesome guitar solos from David Gilmour. Just everything that I love in one Pink Floyd song. And Pigs and Sheep are a great continuation after Dogs, and do a good job of keeping those dark moods going. And they have 2 nice contrasting tempos, with Pigs being a little more down-tempo, and then Sheep has a faster tempo and is really intense and has this sense of urgency to it. And all 3 of these tracks are just absolutely incredible. And like I said, for longer, more stretched out tracks, they are all completely engaging. They do not have one wasted moment. And in my opinion, this is the best record of Pink Floyd's entire discography. And I also have a video ranking all of their studio albums as well, so if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out in the tier list playlist, which will be linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 1 favorite album of 1977. And to recap, at number 5, we had Trans-Europe Express by Kraftwerk. At number 4, we had Talking Heads 77 by the Talking Heads. At number 3, we had Asia by Steely Dan. Number 2 was Low by David Bowie. And number 1 is Animals by Pink Floyd. If you haven't checked out any of these albums and you give them a listen, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments. And please let me know what your top 5 favorite albums of 1977 are. I would love to see your lists. Alright, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 favorite albums of 1978. I'll see you then. Take care.